Well, yeah, we'll get there, and hopefully by the end of it all, you'll still remember what old Isaiah 1 was about. But just to give us that good old classic recap, and my marker's now giving out on me, or maybe I just picked up the wrong one. We know Isaiah, there we go, 1 through 12 gives us that microcosm.
There it is. You want me to say it or?
Yeah.
Microcosm.
There we go, a microcosm of the whole book of Isaiah. And now we're going to kind of start to see a few more microcosms begin to show up. It's not really important to point those out as much as it is the construct of chapters 1 through 12. And then when we get 13 through 23, breaking it down to all the nations around Judah and Israel. And the Lord is not pointing Isaiah to go and actually speak to those people necessarily. It's possible that he is snagging some emissaries, that's more Jeremiah style, that are coming into the precincts of the palace and whatnot to be able to talk with them about what's going to happen here as Assyria becomes a more predominant threat. But more likely, God is just using the prophet to speak openly to the people of Judah and Jerusalem, who he's really assigned to dispel for them what's going to happen in the coming days to each of these kingdoms, and really to kick all of them off as a potential crutch for the people of Judah and Jerusalem to rely on. And it would seem as the story and the scroll progresses, that's not something they really take stock in, because eventually they're going to scheme and try to do that very thing. We'll get to that in just a second, but when we move from 24 to 27, we get this kind of extrapolated out to a more cosmic frame, as what we're going to begin to see is the destruction of all things, and from that, the new city, Jerusalem, which I'm picturing as just a house, but you get it, top of God's cosmic mountain, and then the dichotomization of the people to become true Israel and false Israel. And true Israel made up of the remnants of the faithful who have decided to join God in the plan, his eschatological plan, as he introduces his servant who embodies the true Israel onto the scene, and he will march all of humanity into the concepts presented very early in Isaiah. It might be late-dated oracles, but given to us very early on in Isaiah chapters 2 and 4 of how Jerusalem is going to become the epicenter of the new creation, a mountain in which people are going to river up that mountain to hear the words of God and send it back down to the nations. And then God is going to, through the branch that will beautify Jerusalem, cover this place like a canopy of cloud and fire, mimicking that Exodus story to show that the Exodus is going to culminate in God drawing all humanity to himself. And that eventually is going to give rise, moving past all of this, I don't know why I said 24 to 24. Anyway, we got to where we were last couple of weeks with respect to 36 through 39, and in between all of this, what we have is a more focused view on the kingdom of Judah itself with respect to their schemes, their ploys. This is firmly embedded in the time of Hezekiah as king, and what we discussed of the last couple of weeks as we jumped into that historical block, kind of pulled out of 2 Kings chapters 17 and 18. That looking at that as our backdrop, we appreciate that Hezekiah, while faithful on one side of that coin, is not so much on the other side of that coin, which doesn't surprise us, as goes being a descendant of David and lining him up with all the rest who've come from him in the way they've accorded themselves in their relation to God as the Son of God, also the Son of David. And now here we are, 40 through 41, which here 39 ends with the prophecy that at some point Babylon is going to come and take away the remnant of Judah that's left. Yeah, I don't know. I guess my brain just decides not to work at some point. Yeah, I don't know why that is. And take them off into a new exile, a new Egypt. And of course, the northern kingdom for more than a century now has been absent the geopolitical stage, as Assyria has already snagged them up. But nevertheless, chapter 40 is going to fast forward past that 70-year time block to an extent. Now, I want to try to lay this groundwork now, and I recognize it's entirely possible it could be confusing. So I will try to be as straightforward with it as I can and, reiterate it at multiple points along the way. But if any time I've confused you and you don't know where we are with respect to, is this during the period of the exile, or is this potentially after the period of the exile, then we can try to slow it down and explore that a little bit. But basically, where we are starting at is, let's just call it more generically, the post-exilic period. Okay, now that could back up into some of the period of the exile, so we could kind of give it a little bit of a prologue of some period during the exile. It wouldn't be the entirety of the exile, literally that moment of the flash burn in the pan of them leaving Jerusalem because Nebuchadnezzar has just destroyed the place. But sometime deep into that 70-year stint of time, and then of course creeping up to the dawn of the new era that comes after that once exile is over with. And so chapter 40 will also serve as something of a prologue to the court case that's going to play out over chapters 41 through 48. And we're going to dabble our toes into that a little bit tonight with chapter 41, but of course draw it out over the next several weeks, as it will take us that long to eventually get to 48. So exile's over, and Judah is going to experience a new exodus. Beginning in verse 1 of chapter 40, Comfort, my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and announce to her that her time of hard service is over. Her iniquity has been pardoned, and she has received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins. A voice of one crying out. Let me just make this plain, and it's right on par for what you would expect for Isaiah, but a lot of this is going to feel somewhat disjointed, that we're going to move very rapidly in a very jolted fashion from one story frame right into another one with no seamless transition. It's going to be just hear it, move on, hear it, move on, okay? That's going to be the way a lot of this is presented, but as we slow it down and try to explore it, I think we'll find the seamlessness is actually there. It just requires us to appreciate it with a fair degree of patience. Prepare the way of the Lord in the wilderness. Make a straight highway for our God in the desert. Every valley will be lifted, and every mountain and hill will be leveled. The uneven ground will become smooth, the rough places a plain, and the glory of the Lord will appear, and all humanity together will see it. For the mouth of the Lord has spoken. A voice was saying, cry out. Another said, what should I cry out? All humanity is grass, and all its goodness is like the flower of the field. The grass withers, the flower fades, when the breath of the Lord blows on them. Indeed, the people are grass. The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of the Lord remains forever. See how that is just completely disjointed? We go from crying out in the wilderness, make straight the paths of the Lord. Now another voice maybe cries out to the same person to cry something new, as it seems, and that's to pronounce something of a negative judgment. Humanity's like grass. It folds up and withers away when the life-giving breath of God blows on it. So what does that mean? Well, we're going to try to unpack that. So, this command to comfort maybe is seen in the frame of the divine counsel, which takes us way back to chapter 6, when Isaiah is getting a chance, as this is his moment of his calling, and we actually see the synchristic moment where he is actually getting to peer into God's divine counsel. This is only alluded to with respect to certain prophets. Jeremiah calls out others for their false prophecies, saying they don't get to peer into the divine counsel of the Lord, else they wouldn't be speaking lies. Micaiah, standing there in front of Ahab and Jehoshaphat, says plainly the Lord has arrayed his court, surrounded by his countless of thousands of holy ones, and they are discussing how exactly God is going to lead Ahab to his ultimate demise in this battle. All that to say, when Isaiah is there in the temple at the moment of a vision, but yet seeing heaven and earth united together and God touching both realms at the same time, these seraphic creatures flying above him, volleying back and forth, the doxology of the Lord's holiness and how the earth is filled with his glory. He is hearing then the call after his sins are atoned for, his lips are cleansed, to carry God's message to his people, right? So this could potentially be another moment like that. Now, let me say briefly, this is one of those moments where scholars have a tendency to split hairs on whether or not Isaiah actually wrote everything that we have left in this scroll. I'm not going to advocate one opinion over another. There is good creedal basis for both of them. All that to simply say, to say that Isaiah may not have written this part of the scroll and sealed it up and left it for others, stemming from flow of information that's coming from chapters 8, 12, and 29 of the scroll of Isaiah. And these are actually his disciples carrying on in his tradition after the exile is over with, or late during the exile, when the exile is coming to an end, and afterwards, a possibility. Nonetheless, the idea here is that it's still keeping in line, seemingly, with that tradition of the call of the prophet and the commission to now tell something. Whereas in chapter 6, it's not a good message. Overall, it's not a good message because it's going to seal the fate of the doom of the people. But now it comes with a new message, and that is to comfort God's people, to speak tenderly to them, which of course is in complete juxtaposition against everything we've read in the previous 39 chapters. Everything was a cycle of woe upon woe upon woe. And we know, as I've told you many times over, a woe is practically a death sentence. So there's nothing good or positive that comes from that. And so Isaiah has basically been taking a sledgehammer to the tiny little nail that was Judah and just pulverizing them with the judgmental words of God, albeit, of course, it's been kissed with the sweetness of God's promise of redemption in the end, but that's going to come through the fiery storm of judgment and exile. But now, if that time is over with, the time has come for God to caress his people with that gentleness, having his anger assuaged. So, remember, he said in Isaiah 29, woe to Ariel, which we remember as a code word for Jerusalem, the city where David camped. You will be brought down. You will speak from the ground like the cursed serpent in Genesis 3, and your words will come from low within the dust. You will not be humbled any lower than that, because there's nowhere else to go other than death. Announce to her time of hard service is over with. And this hard service is euphemistically a term for the time spent in Babylon. Euphemism is just a phrase that means something negative. So hard service is that time spent in her exile. So again, it's possible that these words are coming to them with the future goal in mind, that is coming very soon, or it may be coming from that frame of reference that it's already passed, and now if the exile is over with, it was literally like flipping on a switch. Cyrus gives them the edict to go home, to rebuild temple and city, and with that, they're not slaves anymore. They have complete legal freedom to be able to go back home, and shortly after that, many will hitch up their wagons and begin to do that very thing. They don't linger very long, or at least those who are zealous about wanting to go home, to undertake that endeavor. So with that, what I'm saying is that if this is indeed truly all post-exilic, then this would see them back in the land, and this pronouncement being read back to them that indeed God is intending to comfort his people, not extend their hardships. Because their iniquity, another translation of this word from Hebrew would mean punishment, has been pardoned. This word also comes from places like Leviticus chapter 1. In Leviticus 1, it's the breakdown of the burnt offering and the proper animal that has to be offered in the place of the worshiper, and the laying of the hands on the head for the sake of the animal and the worshiper becoming one in their essence, so that the animal represents the person as it's burnt, combusted, and its smoke rises up to the summit of God's cosmic mountain, carrying the worshiper with them. And by virtue of that animal, the worshiper is accepted in God's sight. So another way of reading this would be that the punishment for their crimes is accepted. That means they get to leave this behind. They should not be carrying that into an uncertain future for them, wondering whether or not God is still intending ill will toward them, because maybe our comeuppance has not yet been paid in full. God is saying the bill has been paid, and there is nothing left to your charge for this, okay? Now, of course, it's easy for us to read these terms in a New Testament vein or way of thinking and look at them from the perspective of what we get redemptively in Christ, and look at this as being an announcement to them that their sins have been swept away permanently, such that it's no longer laid at their charge, and if they were to die now, they all get to go to heaven as their reward kind of thing. We are not supposed to be superimposing New Testament terminology onto Old Testament stories and or oracles like this, and with that read into it the meaning that comes through the soteriology, or the teaching of the doctrine of salvation from the New Testament, everywhere we find an English word like iniquity, which must mean sin, or pardon, which must mean that somehow there was a substitute given in their place so that they could have their sins cast upon it and they get off scot-free. That's not always in the context. They paid for this. No substitute was put in their place. They spent every year of that 70 years that Jeremiah said they would in exile. So, and then she's paid double for her sins, right? But we'll get to that in a second. We remember this comes from the pronouncement of Isaiah in the first chapter. His opening words to the nation of Judah was, they are a sinful nation, weighed down with iniquity. But as goes the utilitarian nature of Hebrew itself and how versatile this language is, iniquity in that context means guilt, which could also be read here into chapter 40, that her guilt has been pardoned or accepted, but a more befitting way of doing it or looking at it would be to say her punishment. So in Isaiah 1, they're weighed down with guilt. They're not weighed down with punishment, although in a sense, he is kind of forecasting that when he goes on to ask the question, why beat you anymore? You don't listen. You're hard-headed. You haven't learned from anything that you've been subjected to up till now, so what is the point? All that to simply say, that she has received double for her sins would carry us back to a context like Exodus chapter 22. Here is an edict that is given that should a man be found with the stolen donkey his neighbor has brought to the awareness of the local magistrates that is missing and he suspects his neighbor may actually have it, and the investigation reveals indeed the neighbor stole it, the neighbor not only has to give that animal back, but must pay double the value of the animal. Here, that context that concept in this context means that Israel has not received double punishment for her sins. She is being paid back double favor for her sins. That is what we're going to see unpacked over the course of these many, many chapters that are going to carry us through the end of this scroll. So in other words, while they receive the just punishment, God is not only going to give them reward, he is going to give them twice as much reward for the amount of punishment they received. Which if what they got was death in exile, that what they are reaping on the other end of this, as goes double, is nothing but life and life abundant, okay? Not just materialistically, but spiritually. Remember, we're forecasting the age of Messiah to come on the heels of this. So then we immediately switch to the concept of another voice is crying out. By another voice, I'm just saying it seems like someone else is brought into this mix. We're not told this is the person who is compelled to speak the words, comfort, comfort. We just wrap it all together and assume it's the same person. Maybe it is. Maybe it's not. Either way, prepare the way of the Lord in the wilderness and make straight his path. Make straight a highway for our God in the desert. Looking at a note I have over here. I forgot. Let me go back to verse 2. We're only in verse 3, so just cut me a little slack. But I connected this also to Isaiah 22 when he said in verse 14, the Lord of armies has directly revealed to me this iniquity will not be wiped out. Remember the context of 22 was seemingly it was the victory party right after the Assyrian army is defeated and Sennacherib is packed up, and now the people realize the threat has been averted. They've survived this crisis. They're all celebratorily dancing, and Isaiah is weeping and calling them fools, basically. How can you celebrate when you have yet to fully repent over your sins and turn from the very thing that's led you to this point in time, right? And so because of their posture of heart and their proudness over what's happened, the prophet goes on to say, this iniquity will not be wiped out for you people as long as the Lord God of armies, as long as you live, the Lord God of armies has spoken. But now in chapter 40, for them to say that their iniquity has been pardoned or their guilt has been, punishment has been accepted, it seems to be quite the dramatic reversal of the posture of the prophet in Isaiah 22. And of course, he goes on to say in Isaiah 33 that when Zion is restored, none there will say, I am sick, because the people there will be forgiven their iniquity or their guilt. So we have these weird moments where we have seemingly a permanence to their iniquity that will never be expunged, and yet in other places the promise that the people who will somehow survive what God is saying will come upon them, this moment of doom and great troubling crisis, some will survive, and they will make it to the newly restored Zion, and they will somehow, for some reason, have their iniquity forgiven. That moment has now come, in a sense. It's being inaugurated. It will not reach its fullness until the suffering servant of Isaiah 53 has done what is predicted of him. But we are a ways away from that yet. Prepare the way of the Lord, right? Make straight his path. To prepare the way, this is it. Even though I have told you at the top of this slide, they are experiencing a new Exodus. This is not necessarily an Exodus picture. And let me explain that. Because what is not being said here is that these people are having to prepare the way for them to leave Babylon. That way has already been prepared. We know that because just a few chapters before this in Isaiah 35, we are told that a road will be there. Again, this is the restoration of Zion. A road will be there, and it will be called the Holy Way. But the redeemed will walk on it. The ransom of the Lord will return and come to Zion. This is them leaving the exile, the captivity that's promised for them, to now come back to Zion to be reconciled to God in right, proper covenant relationship. This is a preparation of the way for God to come, okay? Not the people to come, for God to come. This is seen more so in the vein of something like what Moses says in his poetic song of Deuteronomy 32 when he says, "The Lord came from Sinai, and he appeared to them in Seir." Imagine this, the great highway prepared for a king with all of his pomposity that's going to follow after him, this massive entourage of this people, of those who are coming to expound and extol his greatness to all those who have the pleasure and experience of his company as he passes by them, right? Or he's coming on the way to his people. That's the idea here, is that the king is being escorted, perhaps to his own capital city where his palace is, or on some great type of parade ordeal or something to that extent. And the imagery that is given to us here is that literally, if every valley is to be lifted up, imagine the potholes in the road that they can get filled with asphalt. Now we've got a nice semi-smooth surface to ride over and doesn't jeopardize your alignment or the shape of your wheels. And you take all the mountains and you level them down to where they don't obstruct the horizon. Everything is nice, flat, and smooth. Even the uneven ground becomes smooth and all the rough places a plain. Every obstacle is moved out of the way so that God can come to his people. Now, in a sense, this almost does wrap up in it some Exodus type of language, right? Because that's kind of what you have with respect to God bringing his people out of Egypt to himself. At least that's the way he paints the picture, even though it was something of a winding trail that eventually got them there as they moved from one site to another, resting for water and food and just the recoupment that they needed. But then he pictures this as him bringing his people to himself at Sinai on eagle's wings, like they literally jumped on the back of a massive bird and just flew there and were there within minutes with the relative ease of soaring on the back of the wind. Wasn't quite like that, though, right? So in some sense, it does kind of invoke that Exodus imagery, but it's not the people coming, it's God coming, rather, to his own people. But that is a pivotal part of this new Exodus backdrop that we're going to be discussing. Because the glory of the Lord will appear, all humanity will see it. So let's back up, take these verses in a larger frame. When we have in verse 2 the fact that the person is supposed to speak tenderly to Jerusalem, this is juxtaposed against chapter 6. Chapter 6 came with a very paralyzing, compulsory statement given to the prophet to then move on to the people. When he says, go to these people and tell them, keep on listening, don't understand. Keep on seeing, never see. Keep on hearing, and never really perceive, right? Make the minds of these people dull so that they will not respond because their eyes and ears are deaf and blind. And he asks, how long do I do this? Until everything is completely ruined, until the cities lie in total, utter devastation. That's the end result of this prophetic ministry that he is going to take to the people. However, now that that in essence has happened, the northern kingdom of Israel is gone. If this started in the days of Uzziah, there was still a broken kingdom, but a present northern kingdom of Israel in the days of Hezekiah, that is no more. They are gone. And so with that then, if Sennacherib came in and laid total waste to Judah, and there's hardly anything left except for mounds of destroyed cities that the people are going to have to go back and repair and fix. The only thing left standing in its entirety or its basal level of integrity is Jerusalem. Then it's in the wake of this horrible devastation that now we can say that moment of what was put forth to Isaiah himself, the prophet, in Isaiah 6 has come and gone. It's time for a new message. And it's not coincidence that in Isaiah 6, when he is standing there in the presence of the Lord, he sees the Lord's glory. But that was only for him. Nobody else got the glimpse of that image. It was just him. But now we have a new message. He is compelled to go and speak comfort and speak it widely and broadly to all of these people. And at the end of this, God is going to come to his people, and everyone will get the chance, not just the prophet. Everyone will get the chance to see the glory of the Lord. And to say that they will see it, maybe in some way this actually links back to Isaiah 35 itself. Remember, when Zion is restored, some of that comes with the signs of the lame will leap, the mute will speak, the deaf will hear, the blind will see. How many times in the chapters around that area did we cover that we were told the prophets are losing their ability to be able to see because they are stumbling in their stupor that's not brought on because of excessive drink, but because God has blinded them from seeing? It was forecasted in Isaiah 6 that they would only grow more and more dull to hearing and seeing truth until eventually they are totally blind and deaf to it altogether. But now that is reversed. The blindness is gone to the extent where not only do they now appreciate the truth, they can see God as goes his very glory. Verse 6, a new voice crying out, and he's asking, what should I cry out? This goes back to the beginning of this chapter. It's one and the same, apparently. The one who is speaking tenderly to Jerusalem is now going to cry out loud that all humanity is grass. Now, here's the reason why we always have to be a little bit cautious when it comes to how we take portions of Isaiah and slap it on something like a little desk calendar, or maybe highlight a couple of verses and want to send that to somebody as an inspirational morning devotional text. Because when you read this, even when you just isolate this passage to make it part of a Sunday school lesson, here you are, nestled firmly in the heart of the Isaiah scroll, and without any context of what's come before this, you're going to completely miss out on how this links back to what just came before this. I say just before, but it actually is all the way back to chapter 28. We remember those verses in Isaiah 28, verses 3 and 4, the pronouncement against Ephraim, that's synonymous with the kingdom of Samaria or northern Israel. The majestic crown of Ephraim's drunkards will be trampled underfoot, the fading flower of his beautiful splendor. So capture, if you will, here the hyperlink between the two. The context being from Isaiah 28, of course, while that oracle is given solely to the kingdom of Ephraim, this can be extrapolated to the fate of Judah as well, and God's collective house of all of Jacob's people, all 12 tribes, from Dan to Beersheba. To say that all humanity is grass is true because all humanity is seen in the same vein. But remember, and I'm going to recycle this word again, but in a different way, Israel's story is just a microcosm of what happens for all of humanity. What God chooses to do with Israel is not because he likes one people and hates everybody else. What he is using them for, and this is most profoundly amplified in Isaiah, namely in the corridor of 41 through 48, God is always intended to use them as a witness to the people of what he wants to do for them. To show them, if I can do it here, I can do it there. If I can do it for them, I will do it for you. Think of a contractor. What contractor goes and shows up on somebody's door bidding for a job and they ask, can you show me some samples of what you've done? Sorry, but I don't have anything for you to look at. Okay, then I'm probably going to listen to the next 3 bids that come after you, because if you can't show me the quality of your work, I don't really care to hear what you have to say after this. Promise me what you want. I have nothing to go on to know whether or not your credibility is trustworthy. That cannot be said of God, right? Because as what we'll see over the course of these next 7 chapters is that Israel has not proven themselves to be a faithful witness. They in every way have been an unfaithful witness. But God is still going to use them, unfaithful as they are, to be a witness to the nations of His faithfulness and His goodness that He intends to shine upon all mankind. So, indeed, humanity is like the grass of the field. They think themselves to be full of glory. It's vainglory, and it will pass away as briefly and as quickly as the grass that's here today, but gone tomorrow, right? The breath of the Lord will blow on them, and of course, the idea is that they will fade, and they need to fade. Understand what I mean by that. They need to fade. One of the greatest truths of Scripture is as it is enumerated in both testaments of Scripture, is that God resists the proud, but He gives grace to the humble. And these people who He is covenanted with have only acted proudly over the duration of their history and their covenant arrangement with God. Their glory needs to fade away so that His glory can shine through. His life-giving breath is the very thing that also has the ability to bring with it the taking away of life. Because as God speaks and gives life, He can speak and remove life. And over the last 39 chapters, that's what He's been doing. He has been projecting to them that He will systematically dismantle them as a culture, as a civilization. He will break them down into a fractured people and cause them to subside like a parasite does on a host, to survive in another nation and everything that nation gives them, in order to then rebirth them like a new baby into a new creation He has for them, to then become the first fruits of a new humanity. Does that make sense? Because He also goes on to say in Isaiah 25 that as He is fading the flower of Ephraim's crown, He is also going to project Himself as the crown that will then overtake and overshadow them. On that day, the Lord of armies will become a crown of beauty and a diadem of splendor to the remnant of His people. So, we recognize at the end of verse 6 and, verse 5. I forgot what popped up on my screen. Yeah, at the end of verse 5, the mouth of the Lord has spoken. At the end of verse 8, the word of the Lord remains forever. That what was is no longer. It has come and passed. The word of Yahweh has declared it so, along with what is to come. In other words, God has said that the flower of humanity must fade for His glory to shine forth, so that humanity itself can find the destiny that it's always had, as goes its glory that it was supposed to bear out in its original created state, in the God who now has become their glory, as they have been resisting Him all along. He has declared it so, and nothing will change the course of that, even our unfaithfulness. It's a lot. Any questions on that so far? Don't count me out yet. I know it's 6:45. We've got a little bit of a late start. But there are some short slides like this, and that was by far the most jam-packed slide I've got. So I think the worst is behind us. She always bets against me. Zion, herald of good news. Go up on a high mountain. Jerusalem, herald of good news. Raise your voice loudly. Raise it. Do not be afraid. Say to the cities of Judah, here is your God. See, the Lord God comes with strength, and His power establishes His rule. His wages are with Him. His reward accompanies Him. That should be tickling your brain somewhere, because the Revelation scroll ends with these very words. I digress. He protects His flock like a shepherd. He gathers His lambs in His arms and carries them in the fold of His garment. He gently leads those who are nursing. So it's on the previous slide, and it would require me to hit the back button about 50 times to get all the way back to verse 1, where that's the only verse on the screen. But in verse 1, the good news of comfort is coming to Jerusalem, right? Comfort my people. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem. But now, what is Zion, which is synonymous with Jerusalem? What are they doing? If they are the herald of good news, what does a herald do? Right. So it's not coming to them to stay with them. It's coming to them to be what? Turned outward and projected to everyone from there. This should bring with it a vision of what we've already seen way early on in Isaiah. It's a key chapter. In fact, I'll give you a hint. It's in the first 12 chapters. What chapter do we have where the word of the Lord is mentioned being broadcast out from Jerusalem/Zion? Check on learning here. Heath, you got a free pass. You weren't with us at that moment. Okay. But I have said it several times over, so it would be extra points for you, my friend, if you were able to guess it. In fact, I even mentioned it tonight. So close. 2, Isaiah 2.
So close. But I doubt you for the most.
That's right. Remember in verse 3 of Isaiah 2, he will teach us about his ways so that we will walk in his paths, for instruction will go out of Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. So even if we are talking about the prospect of Isaiah the prophet writing a good portion of the scroll, and his disciples spanning over a generation or two, 70 years, writing around the end, or past the period of the exile into their restoration in the land, they are making it a point to take the word that they receive from the Lord and bridging it back to his original oracles. Because in every way, these threads are tying together what has come before from the mouth of the prophet. Remember, we can never let it go too far in the recesses of our mind. The very words that God gives us in Deuteronomy chapter 8. I think it is 8. Sometimes my mind gets crossed. It's either 8 or 18. The true test for the prophet that Moses clearly tells the people. If a man comes along and claims he has received a word from the Lord, he speaks it, and yet that fails to come true, guess what? He's not a prophet. So for a guy like Isaiah to come along and speak charismatic words does not necessarily mean that everybody is going to start falling at this guy's feet saying, the word of the Lord. They're waiting for something, especially in the sea of other voices around him that might not agree with the things he's saying. Jeremiah probably faced this the worst out of everyone and had plenty of people saying, this guy's not really a prophet. In the end, when the dust settles, it's the vindication that comes to the one whose words were proven true. Exactly. If anything, it probably caused people to think for sure this dude ain't from God. But it's 18. I thought it was 18, but thank you for sharing that with us. And here we are told that they are to say to the cities of Judah. So remember, the kingdom of Judah was left in complete devastation. When Babylon rolled through town, whatever reparations had been made in the decades that intervened between the days of Assyria and Babylon showing up was completely reversed as total wreckage, like a wave of fire came through the land. They are told, here is your God. He comes with strength, and his power establishes his rule. Remember Isaiah 35, right? With the return of the ransom to Zion, we read that verse a minute ago, there will be a way prepared for them, and the ransomed will return. And when they come, they will have strength, and they are supposed to strengthen the fearful, along with the pronouncement that God is coming. This chapter started with the proclamation, a voice will cry out, prepare the way for the Lord. Get every obstacle off the map. The road is going to be wide and broad. He is coming. With that announcement in tow, nothing but strength could be projected to the once devastated kingdom of Judah for the wave of exiles that's going to come back, that God chooses you once more. He wants to dwell with you once more. He wants to use you once more, right? So naturally, a weakened people like this would have every reason to cower. But now they are told not to. Instead, they will receive the strength of it. In Isaiah 35, another select passage, strengthen the weakened hands, steady the shaking knees, say to the cowardly, be strong, do not fear, here is your God. That was projected futuristically from the perspective of Isaiah 35. Now 5 chapters later, many years have passed. That moment is living, breathing reality for them. And his wages are with him, his reward accompanies him. Moving on, or continuing on in chapter 35, Yahweh is coming there with retribution, because we are told in verse 4 of Isaiah 35, the second half of the verse I did not finish a second ago, here is your God, vengeance is coming. God's retribution is coming to his enemies to save you from their clutches. Now, it's not retribution for Zion's enemies. Here he's coming with wages for those who are in Zion. So retribution for the enemies, now comes the reward for all of those who he has welcomed back to Zion. That inheritance, of course, first and foremost is himself. But he has also promised, and will promise in later portions, much more so of this scroll, that the nations are going to bring the wealth of their own kingdoms to beautify the once devastated kingdom of Judah, for them to become the preeminent nation amongst the nations. And think of this. This is how he projects the way he is going to care for them. See, in verse 10, we have this concept of him displaying himself with a full array of his power. Literally, his arm is what is seen to be stretched out. That is not in our English translation from the CSB. Others will render it more accurately. But the idea is that here it exudes great militaristic might. Remember the Exodus story, what he tells Moses to tell the people, that God is going to stretch out his arm and rescue his people. That with the stretching out of the arm comes the decimation of the kingdom of Egypt, all the way back to Genesis 15 to Abraham. The people who will oppress his descendants, God will judge them. Now it comes through the plagues, the wonders, as he pulls his people out of there. So verse 10 is showing us that God is going to do the same thing, establish his rule as he stretches out his arm to rescue his people. But here in this verse, the arms of Yahweh to his people are not mighty or militaristic in that sense. They are gentle and caring. Because with those same mighty outstretched arms, he is going to scoop them up like tender lambs. And as a shepherd would, put that lamb in the fold of his garments and tuck that up into his belt as he continues to trudge through the wilderness, caring for it while it's pressed up against his own personage. That's how he is going to care for this own nation. He gently leads those that are nursing. Moving on, verse 12 through 17. Any questions so far? Who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand? Oh, here we go again, right? So here we've had lots and lots of proclamations of cry this, cry that, speak tenderly. Now we've got these weird questions of who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand? Appreciate, with some patience, the fact that people do get very jilted by this book and can easily put it down because it's like, I can't keep this stuff straight. It's moving all over the place. We're going to make sense of it. Who has measured the waters of the hollow of his hand, or marked off the heavens and the span of his hand with the span of his hand? Who has gathered the dust of the earth in a measure, or weighed the mountains on a balance, and the hills on the scales? Who has directed the Spirit of the Lord, or who gave him counsel? Who did he consult? Who gave him understanding and taught him the depths or the paths of justice? Who taught him knowledge and showed him the way of understanding? Look, the nations are like a drop in the bucket. They are considered as a speck of dust on the scales. He lifts up the islands like fine dust. Lebanon cedars are not enough for fuel, or its animals enough for a burnt offering. All the nations are as nothing before him. They are considered by him as empty nothingness. So I didn't highlight the entire verse, just those things that all share some measure of commonality of measuring, marking off, gathering, weighing, and all that stuff. Sorry, I don't know why that popped up on the screen. But each of these phrases marks the exact preciseness of the work of the one and only Creator, God, balanced by the relative ease of it all. He does it with his hand. He doesn't require expert instruments to be able to help him craft more precisely. He does it simply with the measure of his own hand. Now, you might be asking, what does this have to do with what we just read moving into this portion of this chapter? Great question. Because without that, we're not going to be able to make sense of it. The question now moving forward for these people is going to be whether or not God is really the one who's been at work behind this, and does he have the capability to do it? Now, from an exiled standpoint, that really makes good sense, right? I mean, so what? Some guy told us, as did other voices over the periods of decades that preceded our exile, that this was going to happen, and it did. Hooray for them, they got it right. But now we're here, and they're saying somehow God is going to rescue us from all of this. And I don't see any circumstance that's really shaping up that's going to lead to some king deciding to just let us go and send us back to a land that was once that of our ancestors. So how's this going to be, right? I mean, they're not being oppressed, or at least as far as we have record of, the same way that they were in Egypt, being actually used as a slave force. Many people will choose not to leave Babylon because of the quality and goodness of life that they had there. They erected a community of people that lived there for multiple generations, spanning several centuries after their exile, all the way up until the time of Jesus and even beyond that. But the question then becomes one of God's essential character. Will he, and even if he wills it, can he do this thing of rescuing these people? So now we go on this diatribe of just how powerful God really is. But notice this. We start off first with the mention of Oh, it's not showing up there. I'm keep getting these McAfee notices pop up on my screen. I'm sorry. we have first mentioned the heavens, then the waters, and then the dust of the earth, right? Kind of takes us back to the Genesis 1 sequence here, which mimics, in a sense, the idea of him beckoning to the idea of a new creation that's coming in tow here with what he's about to do. Who has directed the Spirit of the Lord? So, in ancient Near Eastern mythology, consider the fact that they have just spent, or are spending, decades with the Babylonians. They will become firmly enamored with their creation stories, much in the same way those generations of Israelites in Egypt would be with respect to their mythologies, as goes how the world or the cosmos was created and how their gods fashioned all things, including human beings. So in ancient Near Eastern mythology, Marduk, the chief of the pantheon, is the creator god, but he's somewhat limited. In fact, he's not the one who is responsible even for his own existence, as he was progenited by other primordial gods that preceded him, much in the same way the Olympians came from the Titans, and the Titans came from the forces of chaos and so forth before all of that. So Marduk could not bring about creation without first consulting the god Ea, who is the god of wisdom. Now, why is that essentially important, as goes this argument that's being made here, that nobody gives counsel to the Lord? Nobody directs his Spirit, because he works alone. While he might sit amongst the divine council of all of his holy ones arrayed before him, does not mean that he turns to any of them to ask for their permission to do any sort of thing he conspires to do. He works unaided amongst the council of himself in the triunity of his personage. As Job would say, he reveals mysteries from the darkness. He brings the deepest darkness into light. And who gave him understanding and taught him the paths of justice? So understanding and knowledge for the sake of knowing the paths of justice is what's being given here. Or basically, to make this more simple and plain, that he has the power to make the right choice. And he has the power to make that choice at the right time. And one could even go on a little further to say he even has the reasoned capability of making that choice for the right reasons. You might say, awesome. What does that have to do with the grand story here that's being told in Isaiah? Because this community of exiles has got to be wrestling with the question, why are we here? Why am I here? I was born in this place. I'm not responsible for what they did. They did that. And if I was over there, I probably would have done the same. Or that more pious statement, reflecting their own sense of self-righteousness, I wouldn't have done that. I have a bit more common sense than they do, but yet I'm the one paying for this. We know this because more than once, as it said in the scroll of Jeremiah, why did the children say that the fathers eat sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge? They were the ones that ate it, but we're paying for the consequence of it. To say that, though, is to completely take out of perspective here the fact that God is the one who is the grand master of all human history. He's been writing the story. All we ever get is just a tiny little thread of the grand tapestry, the thread that we happen to sit on in the moment when it's being woven into the fabric. We don't know the grand design of it all. He chooses to act when he does according to his purposes and what he chooses to do with that, right? Not for what we will get out of it in that moment. And so when he chooses, it's according to the right choice, or it's with the intent of making the right choice, and it's acting at the right time. So even though he had the power to rescue a year into the exile, 5 years into the exile, 10 years into the exile, why wait 70 years? Yeah, of course, there's the understanding the 70 years of the Sabbaths that in the land of Israel was denied, as goes the sabbatical cycles. But aside from all of that, he could have easily just canceled all of that and acted to rescue them within a few years. But he chose to act when he did, much in the same reason as why he chose to bring Jesus when he did in the fullness of time. Or do anything else that he's done on the grandness of the human stage. So, what does this have to do with the current plight of both Israel and the nations at this point in history? I think we've answered that. Maybe you have a better answer, perspective on that.
As to why he's giving this yeah. I don't have a better answer. I mean,
They said it earlier on in I don't remember what book, the sons are paying the sins of the fathers.
Mm-hmm.
That's what they're doing, they're paying.
And nobody has to teach him these things. He knows them, and he is the one, of course, that examples for us how to follow in this way. And we won't hold all the answers while he does. And in many ways, it mimics the very arguments he is making to Job in the final 4 chapters of the book. Where were you when I? Are you able to? The obvious answer is no, because you don't know everything I know. Therefore, you have to simply trust that what I'm doing is for the best, for everyone, including you. And who taught him knowledge and showed him the way of understanding, right? The nations are a drop in the bucket. They are but specks of dust on the scales, islands like fine dust. These are ways of really showing us the finiteness of our own selves and all of the rest of creation for that matter. But understand that first, this is a drop in comparison to the waters. Go back up to verse 12. He holds the waters. That means all of the seas that are present on this planet in the hollow of his hand. And on top of that, floating on what seems to be this blue marble orbiting the sun are these tiny little drops of landmass all over the place where human civilization has flourished. How much smaller in perspective are they than the seas? Just a tiny little drop in the bucket, right? Or consider the speck of dust in verse 1, right? As goes the island nations. And all the nations are nothing to him. They are considered as an empty nothingness. But that means that he is unaided and he is unimpeded in creation. And Yahweh does not require the assistance or permission of the nations to do anything. Understand that. He does not require counsel with Babylon to say, this is what I seek to do with my people. Is it okay if you would consider relinquishing them back to my custody so that I can lead them back to where I founded them all those generations ago so that I can now flourish them once over? There is no conciliatory nature in this. It's not a negotiation, by no means. And so with that then, if he does not need their permission to restore his people, he doesn't need their permission to turn to him either. If his goal and agenda is to use Israel as a faithful witness to the nations with the ultimate idea of turning the nations to himself, he does not need their cooperation in doing so. Ultimately, he will have that, as was projected through the prophet Malachi to close out the Old Testament. Incense and offering will be offered unto me everywhere the sun rises. That means there's literally not a speck that's going to exist on the map where God's name is not known and is not made great, in spite of what humanity will do, right? To say that they are worthless is not to say that they are worthless to him. It just means that before him, they are worthless. And it comes from that word that actually shows up first in Genesis, tohu, which means void or chaotic, basically. That they are just like the primordial world that was in that chaotic state before God spoke and began to bring order upon the face of the planet for creation to then thrive. They are senseless and chaotic without him and, of course, before him, because they do not stand equal to him in power or might. He is transcendent above it all. And it also doesn't need to go without mentioning here that in almost all of the entirety of this chapter, the word that we have translated for God is actually the Hebrew word El. Simply those 2 letters, which is probably the most accurate rendering that can show God's transcendence above all else, because that precedes every name that is given to him. El Shaddai, El Elyon. It's to show that he exists alone and apart above everything else, without the need of anything else. And that feeds into these verses where it says, so with whom will you compare God? What likeness will you set up for comparison for him with him? An idol? Something that a smelter casts and a metal worker plates with gold and makes silver chains for? A poor person contributes wood for a pedestal that will not rot. He looks for a skilled craftsman to set an idol up that will not fall over. Do you not know? Have you not heard? Has it not been declared to you from the beginning? Have you not even considered the foundations of the earth? God is enthroned above the circle of the earth. Its inhabitants are like grasshoppers. He stretches out the heavens like a cloth and spreads them out like a tent to live in. He reduces princes to nothing, makes judges of the earth like a wasteland. They are barely planted, barely sown. Their stem hardly takes root in the ground. When he blows on them and they wither, and a whirlwind carries them away like stubble. More confusion, right? Let's unravel it. So, again, as I just said, I didn't realize I had gotten ahead of myself, but this is reflecting the most utter transcendent nature of God And so, by going on to speak about these idols, something that either a smelter will cast, meaning a molten image, a block that actually has a mold by which you pour the molten metal in it. I almost said molten lava. The molten metal inside of it and let it cool, and it becomes the form of what you meant to cast. Or an image that you actually have to take and carve out of a lump of clay or a piece of wood. It covers the whole broad spectrum of idols in and of itself. There is nothing that can be carved into a likeness of anything that can compare to God. And of course, every one of these images ultimately represents what? A God. And that God is supposed to govern what? Anything. Some aspect of existence, right? It can be anything from human fertility to the spirits that you find out in nature to water and its cycle of replenishing the earth. It doesn't matter. Again, God, transcendent above it all, is not to be brought down to their level and considered to be one among many. He is the one above all. And so, I think this is almost meant to be something of a satirical jab to say that a poor person contributes wood for a pedestal that will not rot. And what I mean by that is a god is only worth what it's constructed from, right? I mean, there's no grandeur or glory from a tiny little clay terracotta image of Marduk this big that sits in a tiny little household shrine versus one that stands about 15 feet tall that's made out of solid gold. What would be more valuable in the eyes of anyone, right? That represents the glory. Huh? Yeah. That represents the glory and grandeur that is befitting of Marduk. But considering that no eye has ever actually seen Marduk, who knows what it is that is befitting of this deity's glory, right? It's what you esteem it to be based off how he's represented before you. Equally worthless is the idea that the God himself, which cannot even support himself to stand up, because if he's not properly crafted to balance himself, he might topple over. And so therefore, the craftsman has to create the proper balanced idol on the properly balanced pedestal. And if the thing is still just a bit too top heavy, make chains to connect to hoops made on the thing to help it to stand upright or erect so that it doesn't fall over and either destroy itself or some innocent bystander in close enough proximity. It's pretty pathetic, right? When the idol doesn't even have the power or ability, the God or the God it represents, to hold that statue in place.
Was it in the book of Isaiah where he already talked about making other items and follow them? Or was it in another one of our studies?
So no, you're right. And this is actually where we are in this particular portion of Scripture, because he's going to carry this thought all throughout these 9 chapters from 40 through 48. He's going to constantly keep coming back to this concept of worthless idols. So you're thinking in the right spot. We did cover Isaiah 44 many months ago. So I'm proud of the fact you had something left from that lesson to bring into this, man. And so the question here seems to be put to Israel. Now, it's possible it could be broadcasted out to the nations, but that seemingly doesn't begin to happen until we actually get into the context of Isaiah 41. So to know stems from what has been heard. And of course, that came from the beginning, in which the foundations of the earth itself bears witness to the fact that Yahweh is Creator God, and he revealed himself exclusively to Israel. So I know at this point it kind of gets a little bit confusing. A lot of things going on here. What are we talking about? Let's sum it up. Beginning of chapter 40. Speak boldly and loudly to everyone the comfort that is meant to come to Israel. Speak tenderly toward Jerusalem. Make sure they understand that they have paid in full everything that was required of them, and now God is going to give them twice as much back in return. Moving beyond that, he then begins to say, let this also be coupled with that message that God is coming. And so let everyone begin to prepare the procession for which God is going to now visit his people, as he is going to stand in your presence. And because he will be so close in proximity to you, you will have no reason to fear anything else going on around you. He will completely dispel and disarm anything that will threaten or rise to threaten you. So take cover in the fact that he now, as a shepherd, is going to reach out mightily against them as he did Egypt of old. He is going to bring them down and humble them. but tenderly embrace and caress you like a tiny little lamb that he folds up in the clothes or the folds of his garment, right? And so, if that's the case, listen here, Judah. If you're wondering how God is going to do this, then who were you comparing him to question the nature of his own ability? The only thing you have to compare him to is anything else that vaunts itself or props itself up as being something of supernatural origin and power. That would be the gods that you see paraded around you everywhere in the precincts of these temples and shrines that litter Babylon. But what can those gods do? Look at them. Tell me what a god who a person had to actually spend time to craft out of stone or out of metal, if that thing does not hold the power to even cause itself to stand upright, and yet I'm the God that has caused everything to exist. And if you're not entirely sure, go back and ask the foundations of the earth, who bear witness to what my power is. But not only that, you've heard this from the beginning, because I spoke it to you. If I spoke it to you and you heard it, then why would you question my power? Because I revealed myself to you above all nations, so that you would know who I am and what I can do. Hopefully that makes sense of what we've covered so far. Kind of gets us the right frame of mind. In fact,
Need a whole recap like that.
yeah.
Right, and all of it, you know.
In fact, God says so much through Moses in Exodus 20. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. You have seen that I have spoken to you from heaven. Never forget that. God is enthroned above the circle of the earth. Believe it or not, this passage does not exist here to support our creationist arguments that perhaps there was a contingent of people who in medieval times actually believed the earth was spherical in shape and not flat. This actually teaches something way deeper than that. But oftentimes, this is the only reason this verse ever gets visited in the book of Isaiah. So this serves to answer the questions postulated by the previous verse, that God is sovereign. To say he sits over the circle is not to call into question whether or not the earth is truly spherical or globular in shape. Think about it. You go out there and you look at the horizon. Exactly. Whether you're talking about the stars or anything else that passes overhead or even just the horizon out in front of you, you have to do it by twisting your head 180 degrees. It still follows the same trajectory of a circle. So to say that he sits above the circle, it means that he sits enthroned above the waters that are above over everything else. While these terrestrial gods live here and they have their holiest shrines on the highest mountains that we can see around us, and that's where those gods live. Yet this God lives way up there above it all, right? And no doubt, right? No doubt. But then it speaks about how he stretches out the heavens like a thin cloth and spreads them out like a tent to live in. But to say that when you go outside, because we have the veil of the bright blue sky and the white clouds above us that is stripped away at nighttime when the naked eye can seemingly pierce for light years beyond where that canopy ends, often to the fringes of our own galaxy if you get just the right view, or maybe even the planets that orbit around us. And to think that with all of that space, yet this is just the tent that God houses himself in. He reduces princes to nothing, right? So those who presume to have power are really powerless in comparison. It's easy for us in our day and time, while royalty and noble houses still exist, to look at those people as being nothing more than mortals. And that's all they've ever been, even from the beginning of time. But bygone is the era in which humanity feared the noble class, because they understood the one who sits at the top of that pyramid and wears the crown governs their fates, and with a word can take away everything that is anything to them, including their very lives. And for the longest time, for centuries, they were able to dupe people into thinking that they wielded the power of the gods. That is the context in which this is written. And to say that he reduces princes to nothing is to say that before him, whatever claim they have to the supernatural and divine is gone. It is reduced to what he says here, a wasteland, or again, the use of the word tohu. They're barely planted, barely sown. To say that he blows on them, which goes back to verse 7, right? Humanity is like the grass of the field. Is to say again, as it was, that Israel was fading away and they needed to so that they could be reborn. Here, all of humanity, that all of these power structures as well will be blown away for it to be reforged in what will come from the ash heap of all of that, right? What we got from this corridor of chapters 24 through 27. The one city, the strong city, where all humanity will stream into, and where the servant will lead them to live in and rule over them forever, where the ash heap of the humanity that doesn't want to be a part of that is left, and the ruin of what lays outside that city. 27 through 31, to round out this chapter. Jacob, why do you say? So here's where we get to the heart of it all. All that stuff in the middle of this, after the compulsion to speak, or speak and cry out, and then all this stuff, all this stuff about how powerful God is, to get to this then. Because it's like you making the case in front of your own children when you walk them through those times when you have purposefully looked out for them in a benevolent way. You've told them, so the other day when we were on the highway and you were hungry and you told me you were ready for some food, and I pulled off and I drove us through a McDonald's drive-thru and I got you a Happy Meal. How many times has that happened? How many times have we been on the road? Good dozen? How many of those did you actually sit and starve and miss a meal? None. So I hear you're hungry now. Why then do you think that when you say, I'm hungry, I don't hear you and I'm not going to do anything about it? Here he says, Jacob, why do you say, Israel, why do you assert, my way is hidden from the Lord and my claim is ignored by my God? Do you not know? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the whole earth. He never becomes faint or weary. There is no limit to his understanding, and he gives strength to the faint and strengthens the powerless. Youths may become faint and weary, and young men stumble and fall. But those who trust in the Lord will renew their strength. Here comes that moment from Remember the Titans, where the great big old lineman is just belting it out, right? And renew their strength and will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and will not become weary. They will walk and not faint. So,
Man, I'm just picturing Trump on Eagle.
Yeah.
perhaps the use of both Jacob and Israel here, which is going to become a formula that will be used over and over again, is to actually allude back to the story of the patriarch wrestling with God, right? Remember that night when he's divided his household and belongings up into several small little camps, and he has positioned himself at the back of it all, and then he meets with an unsuspected character that comes literally out of nowhere. We're told is the angel of the Lord, and they wrestle all the way up to the sunrise until this being he's wrestled with just merely touches his hip socket area, and his hip is immediately dislocated, right? Recognizing the power pent up in all of that. Yep, cheating. And in all of this, as he's struggling with this being and he asks to be blessed, he demands to be blessed. What is the end result is that his name of trickster or hill-grabbing deceiver is changed from Jacob to Israel, the one who wrestles with both God and man, touches God and man, and yet prevails in the end. I think in a lot of ways you can say this has been the crux of what we have just went over in chapters 1 through 39. That we are at the end of the rope of how Israel has struggled with both God in their covenant dealings with him, man for all those who just wanted to swallow them up, and has constantly served as thorns in their sides. Usually directed so because God used them as those tools, but nonetheless, and yet has still survived because they still stand today. Not because they're more powerful than either entity, but because God is merciful, as much as he was in that moment with Jacob, when in the one touch of a hand dislocated his hip, could have obliterated him with little to no effort, and yet allowed him to prevail in the end, to receive the blessing that he wrestled away from him because he wanted it. Perhaps that's part of the use, the dynamism of the use of both of the titles for these people. Now, to say their way is hidden would be another way of saying their journey. So consider the exile to the Exodus arc of Jacob's story. What I mean by that is before you even get to the grand story of Israel actually in Egypt to be led out by Moses and the Lord, we have several little stories of exile and Exodus actually going on throughout the book of Genesis. I mean, after all, why is it that Jacob is even out there wrestling with the angel of the Lord? Where is he coming from? Where is he going? He's not coming from his homeland, but he's going to his homeland. But why is he going to his homeland? And where has he been this whole time? He was in Padan Aram, but off to the east, so you're thinking in the right direction.
Old uncle's place. Not uncle.
He's half of the other king.
Well, yeah. Well, and Esau too. He's running from Esau as well.
Right. And he's running from his uncle. Before this moment, he's running from his uncle. But why was he living with his uncle? He's been there for 20 years in exile because of what he did to Esau. Right? So all of that is to say, getting kicked out of the land to go off in the direction of the east, which is just what Israel has endured, to then come back. But they come back because God providentially declared it so. Before he left, 20 years prior to this moment, he's there lying with a rock for a pillow. When he opens his eyes and he sees a ladder going all the way up into heaven and angels coming and going, and at the top of it all is the God of his fathers, Abraham and Isaac. But he says to this God, if this God will watch over me in the land of my sojourn and will bring me back to this spot right here, then he will be my God. What is the story of Israel in this moment? That through 1,000 years he has been their God, and yet 70 years off in exile, he has still preserved them as he did Jacob in Padan Aram, despite the harassment of his uncle and his twisted manipulation of him to keep him subjected, and yet God brought him back and brought him back richer than he left. And what has he done with this nation? Read the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Wagon loads of wealth coming back to beautify city and temple. He has providentially guarded them through it all to remain their God. See, you're getting it, man. You're getting it. That's right. So, ignored in the sense that it's being...
Jesus!
So, to say ignored here is the idea of continuance, that it is being continuously ignored by God, which is in every way contrary to what the story thus far, in all of its myriads and shades of representation, have cried out, as goes the obvious truth. And so, when they talk about, or he asks, do you not know, have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God. The legacy of their history bears perfect witness to the inescapable truth of the tireless God who not only creates, which is just what we walk through, sustains, which is just what we've called into question with the use of Jacob and Israel together, and he is ceaselessly working toward his purposes, which is the refinement of his people for the refinement of the nations. Then we have the parallelisms of these words here, strength and strengthens, coupled with faint and powerless. Also backing up with that, youths and young men to become faint, weary, or stumble and fall. Ultimately, in the end of all that, those who trust the Lord will renew their strength, and they will soar, run, and walk like eagles, not become weary, not faint. So faint as in having no energy at all. Zapped. Powerless as in having no durability, meaning imagine your bones replaced with jelly and then try to stand up. Not going to happen. You're going to sink into a puddle on the floor. But those bones provide amazing rigidity and stability for you to be able to do all manner of things. But to be powerless in this sense is to say bones have turned to jelly. So he gives strength to those who have none. He strengthens and gives durability to those who lack that very thing. Youths and young men, the way these words are used in Hebrew is to speak of youth like a man in his athletic prime. The easiest way for us to think of such a thing is consider the spectacles that go on in rotating cycles every 4 years, right? The Olympics, those people train for years and years to be conditioned into their peak prime performance. Or perhaps something that speaks a little bit more endearingly to our hearts as men who were children of the 80s, or at least to some extent on the heels of the 80s, and remember those great stories of the dioramas fought between Rocky and either Apollo or Clubber Lang or Ivan Drago. Think of all those training sequences where Ivan is just showing how he is the prime specimen of peak human performance. And it makes absolutely no sense that Rocky could step in the ring and even go toe-to-toe with this guy, much less last 15 rounds with him. But in the end,
Rocky was just a southpaw.
you know, he got him. But in the end, that's the idea. But youths, in this sense, will become faint. Youths will be weary, lack energy, and in the end of all things, they will become powerless, but not those who trust in the Lord. Or the young men. Think of this in the perspective or the vein of men of military fighting age. right? Those men are the men you call to battle. You don't put helmets on the heads of and don in the hands of a 10-year-old boy a shield and a spear. You put that on the man who's 20 years or older. You don't give it to the guy who's 70 either, because none of them can keep up or none of them have the courage to do so, right? That's the idea. But even they will stumble and fall. But those who trust in the Lord will renew. The idea of renewing is they will be continuously dosed with strength over and over and over again. Now, again, this is the kind of stuff that makes for great fodder on a desktop calendar or some motivational message to a brother or sister, right? Via text. But this does not exist for that purpose. This exists to show us that in light of what these people are facing and what God is promising, it seems like an insurmountable, overly daunting task. But God is the one who will make it happen. As much as he promised the land of their inheritance would have to come through the conquest of war, and any one of them would stand there with knees quaking, teeth chattering, wondering, am I going to die in this conflict? Will we be consumed like the grasshoppers our ancestors said we were in comparison to the giants crawling around this land? Or will our God prevail and give our enemies into our hands? We can either tuck tail and run or trust. But if we trust, God will continuously renew. So that's what this has to do with this chapter from the beginning up until now, is to pump them full of motivation. All right, it's 7:28, and we've got all of chapter 41. So we're ready?
No. And it's Chris Tomlin.
No, no, it's, but you
Yes,
ain't
Chris
Ah.
Tomlin. And it's bothering me.
To my credit, I said don't count me out. I didn't say I would get it
That's
done.
fair, yeah.
I mean, I gave it to you right up until 7:25.
And then you're like, nope. But, and also, in my studies for this, I have come across some material that said chapter 41 is really suited to go well with 42. So I was intending to break it up, but nonetheless, we'll try to,
You gave me your,
my easy out.
yeah.
My easy out.